Okay, I assume that the webinar has already started. Well, good morning, everybody. We're just going to give it a minute for the audience to trickle in, and at the same time, we'll just wait a little bit for the webinar to happen. Well, it is definitely a interesting time to talk about Afghanistan at this time. Okay, well, I think people are coming in. Okay, we're at 9:01, so we'll continue to let people to come in. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Yun Sun. I'm the director of the China program and the co-director of East Asia program here at the Stimson Center. This webinar is co-hosted with South Asia program of the Stimson Center and is focused on the development in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover, as well as the regional dynamics. So to moderate this panel, we have the honor of welcoming Dan Markey, Dr. Markey, who is a senior advisor on South Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He is also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Foreign Policy Institute. So Dan is a longtime veteran on South Asian affairs, not only Afghanistan, but also Pakistan, as well as China's role in the region. So we're very lucky to have Dan today to moderate this panel. With that, I will hand over this panel to Dan as a moderator. Thank you, Dan, for joining us today.
Yun, thanks. It's great to be with you, and I'm excited about this conversation. All of you have been traveling in some very interesting places and have talked to some fascinating people, and I think have learned a lot. And so I think our audience is in for a real treat today. So let me move right along and do the introductions. We have obviously three panelists. We have Barney Rubin, who is a distinguished fellow with the China program at Stimson. He has a long history of working on Afghanistan, and in 2001, he served as senior advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan. We are, of course, as you just heard, joined by Yun Sun, who is senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at Stimson. She and Barney recently returned from a trip to Doha and to Tajikistan. And the trip report will soon be published on the Stimson website. And last but not least, we have Elizabeth Threlkeld, who is director of the South Asia program at Stimson. And Elizabeth returned from a trip to Pakistan to discuss these Afghan issues as well. So all of you have been in countries surrounding or nearby Afghanistan. All of you spent a lot of time talking about Afghanistan and in some cases, Afghans who are based elsewhere outside of Afghanistan. Maybe I'll kick it back to Yun first, just to get a little bit more flavor for your trip, just so we have a better understanding as to where you went and the types of people you talked to. And if you want to share a couple of top lines, that's great. And then we'll go around the horn and get similar answers from all three of you. So back to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the introduction. So the background of the trip that Barney and I took is really China's role in conflict countries. And because after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, there were all these speculations, even from China, from within China, that China is going to go into Afghanistan to fill the vacuum. And at the same time, China is going to basically take over Afghanistan economically because of the natural resources that are abundant there. So the research that we took is really to find out the real answer to that question, that is China going to Afghanistan, or is China already there? What role China is playing in terms of the domestic politics and also the economic development of the country? And more importantly, what is China's relationship with Taliban? Because last year there were speculations that, well, if China's relationship with Taliban is really that good, maybe diplomatic recognition would be within horizon. So with those questions, we undertook the trip, at least that's a China portion of the trip. And what we have discovered or have found out from the trip is that China is not there yet. Or there are a lot of speculations and a lot of, well, for example, there are a lot of businessmen from China visiting Afghanistan, looking into the business opportunities, but none really has transpired into real project on the ground. And from the Taliban side, there has been talks about how they are going to resume the two very delayed or suspended Chinese mega projects in their country, the anti-copper mine project and the CNPC, I believe the CNPC oil drilling in the, Barney knows the name, Amu Darya Basin.
The Amu Darya
drilling,
Basin in Kurdistan province.
yes. So so those two projects, apparently there have been talks about them being resumed, but in reality, the activities, actual operations has not really showing signs of resumption. There were also even discussion about China setting up a new industrial park outside the suburb of the of Kabul, but at least in the conversations, none of that has really come through either. So last month, I believe it was the vice chair of the Chamber of Commerce in Afghanistan who came out publicly in the media interview complaining that the Chinese said they would be coming, but not a penny has come. I think that's a pretty accurate assessment of where it is. In terms of the political relations and diplomatic recognition, there is not really any sign that China is moving towards diplomatic recognition of Taliban. And I think one primary practical obstacle for China is still the issue of the Uyghur militants. And Barney will have a much better explanation of the difference of understanding as for what Taliban committed or what Taliban promised and what the Chinese expectation or the international community's expectation, including US expectation, really is on this particular issue. So last year when Taliban took over, from all sorts of statements and elaboration of positions from Taliban representative, at least widely circulated in the Chinese media and the Chinese policy community, is that Taliban committed and promised that no one will be allowed to use Afghan territory, Afghan soil, to launch attack against foreign countries. That includes United States, that includes China. So that one line has been very well circulated in China. But I think the Chinese just interpreted that as what Taliban is going to drive out or ask the Uyghur militants residing in Afghanistan to leave the country. But in reality, that is apparently not what has happened. So there are rumors, there are observations that Taliban has moved, for example, some of the Uyghur militants away from the border with China, or basically away from the Chinese territory, but they're not stopping hosting them either. So I think that issue is far from being resolved between China and Taliban. And I would say the Chinese treat that as a precondition for any political recognition or even economic investment to come through. So in that sense, what the Chinese still fully support, what they do say that they fully support is humanitarian assistance. They don't believe that humanitarian assistance should be based on any political conditions, but coming to real commercial activities and economic investment and political recognition, I say that China is still quite far from it. Then it's also China's biggest concern after the Taliban took over was the massive outflow of refugees and also the militants that would travel with refugees. And China's worst nightmare was some of these refugees and militants are going to first go to Tajikistan and then transit to China, because China shares a much longer border with Tajikistan. Well, that did not really transpire at least not between China and Pakistan. Instead, most of the terrorist attacks against Chinese nationals and Chinese assets in the past 12 to 18 months have come from Pakistan. So the terrorist threat, in fact, did not transpire in the north. Instead, it came from a different direction. So I think that also give China a slightly, well, not comfortable position, but slightly more at ease about the terrorist threats directly from Afghanistan towards China, and Pakistan emerged as a bigger challenge. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yun, fantastic, great opening. And I've got some follow-ups, but I want to spread the wealth. So let's go to Barney next. And Barney, I had a chance to review some of the trip report that you pulled together and so on. Sounds like you picked up some really fascinating things about both the internal dynamics in terms of maybe sources of opposition or potential for change inside of Afghanistan, as well as the regional dynamics. So if you could give us a flavor for those, that'd be a great start.
Well, thanks, Dan. Excuse me, and I have to apologize. There's some workmen who are currently replacing all the windows in my building, and therefore, as long as I'm not muted, you're going to be hearing that in the background. I'm sorry for that. But they've already done it in our apartment. I would say that the situation in Afghanistan internally is, while the Taliban are as firmly in control, excuse me, as any Afghan government for the past 45 years, there are considerable sources of contestation and instability. And I would add that many, not instability, and dissension within the government, within the Taliban itself. And I would add that they kind of, some of these things kind of contradict the contention that the United States and its Afghan allies accomplished nothing in the past 20 years, because many of these things that are going on in Afghanistan, while of course the government that we were supporting collapsed, nonetheless they could not have gone on 20 years ago because frankly the connectivity among civil society, the consciousness of an educated middle class in the cities and so on, and I would add the exposure to international diplomacy and the international context of, let's say, second tier and younger Taliban officials are all having some effect on the government. So let's say I would say there are two significant factors within the country which so far are not in sync at all, but that are contesting the Taliban regime. One is there are quite a few public demonstrations, largely led by women, which started in Kabul. But despite the fact that the Taliban's repression of those demonstrations has become more violent and more brutal, so far they are firing in the air, not at the demonstrators, but they do arrest people and mistreat them. Some of them have disappeared, in fact. Nonetheless, they have spread to other provinces, and the longer that the closure of high schools to girls goes on, it seems the longer these things will go. And I should add that they're not exclusively women either. Even the elders in some very conservative Pashtun provinces have supported these demonstrations and told the Taliban leadership that they needed to change that policy. So that contradicts the Taliban claim that they're doing this because of cultural resistance to girls going to school. Second, as I said, there's something which is actually, it's important not only for Afghanistan, but for those trying to engage with Afghanistan, which is that if we take specifically the decision about allowing girls to attend educational institutions at all levels, it seems clear that a very large number of Taliban officials, even up to a very high level, support the idea of girls attending school. And that means it goes all the way. There's been one official who's been very outspoken, which is Sher Mohammad Abbas Stanekzai, who's the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he was the lead negotiator in Doha for some time until Mullah Brother came there. But he's been so outspoken. Recently, he gave a televised address on the International Day of Tourism, in which he sharply criticized the existing policy. He could not have done that on television unless he had high-level support. And it seems that the Minister of Defense, who is the son of Mullah Omar, and the Minister of the Interior, who is the son of Jalaluddin Haqqani, both are opposed to the current policy. But the thing is, the Taliban is a very authoritarian and centralized organization, not in its day-to-day operation, but it's more decentralized. But when the leader decides something, everyone has a religious obligation, not just a political obligation, a religious obligation to obey. In fact, Stanekzai had a debate on television with a very conservative mullah from, I think, from the Supreme Court, in which he said, citing a hadith of Muhammad, that education is compulsory for everyone, all with men and women. And his opponent said, education is not compulsory, but obedience to the Amir is compulsory. So in a way, those are the two principles that are at war. However, it's not just a war of principles. The Taliban are under considerable pressure from, not just from the United States, which we focus on, but from the country's neighbors as well, which are very important because it's always important, but even more important for Afghanistan because it is a landlocked and impoverished country. Their first item of priority that they mention is not always opening girls' schools, though they do mention that, but also to form what they call a more inclusive government, which has not been defined, but means a government that is not essentially a one-party Taliban government, with also Taliban being run by a single individual, basically. And that, in turn, has given the opponents of that policy and similar policies some leverage with the leadership. And there appears to be very quietly a process of reconsideration of it. I'm not predicting what will happen. That's unpredictable. It depends on one man. But there have been meetings in Kandahar, which is the ideological center of the regime, about that. Now, as far as that is unconnected to the so far, I would say, to the external opposition. The National Resistance Front, based in Tajikistan, has managed to maintain its hold on parts of Panjshir and some neighboring provinces, but there's no sign that it will spread. And I think the results of a meeting in Vienna that took place while we were in the region, which was a meeting of fairly high-level former officials of the Islamic Republic and some important political people, illustrates one of the constraints on the National Resistance Front's expansion. And that is, they reached agreement on many issues, but in their final statement, they did not say anything about what the structure of the state should be. In particular, they did not mention decentralization. Now, decentralization of the administration. When you talk to the National Resistance Front and most of the exiled non-Pashtun leaders, their number one issue is decentralization of the administration. Because that is the mechanism through which certain Pashtun elites have controlled the country since the late 19th century. But that is a very ethnically divisive issue, and in fact, I spoke to some of the participants in the meeting in Vienna. Of course, some people raised that issue very forcefully, but finally they had to decide not to put it at all in any form in the final statement because it was simply too divisive. So that means that this opposition is suffering from the same kind of dissension that the others have. And the Taliban of course, favor strong centralized government, as do virtually all Pashtun political actors. It's the one issue on which even the most anti-Taliban Pashtuns agree with the Taliban, and the most religious or Islamic non-Pashtuns oppose the Taliban. So besides all the other, there's that political obstacle. There's no united vision of what would replace the Taliban. Now, if I could just say one thing about the region, then I'll stop. Of course, I mentioned about the meeting in Vienna. What was most interesting about it was what didn't happen. That is, there was no statement about decentralization. What's most interesting about the region is also what didn't happen, because no one in the region has recognized the Taliban as a government, but no one in the region is funding a proxy war against the Taliban. That is, the NRF, the National Resistance Front, while it's based in Tajikistan, is not getting material support from Tajikistan or Tajikistan's security partner, Russia. And there is a consensus embodied in Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings, statements by Russia and China, against anything that would destabilize the country because, I'll end with this, of the increasing threat from the Islamic State, Khorasan province, which is the portion of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, which I should have mentioned this earlier, has been carrying out near genocidal attacks on members of the Hazara and Shia population. So far, Iran has reacted to that only verbally, but I don't know how long that will go on if the Taliban prove themselves unable or unwilling to curb those things. So it is quite a dynamic situation, despite. But the thing is that there is no coherent alternative in place so that the Taliban are able to monopolize the relatively little bit of power that they have.
Fantastic. Thanks, Barney. Lots of different threads that we could pull there, and I hope we'll have time to get back to them. But I do want to move on to Elizabeth now. So Elizabeth, you were in Pakistan. I was lucky enough to be there at least for a couple of days where we overlapped. So I'd be curious, and our audience, I'm sure, is interested in hearing sort of Pakistani perspectives on the problem of Afghanistan, and then to the extent that you can speak to it, how Afghanistan is affecting Pakistan directly.
Thanks so much, Dan. And I was going to say it was great to have a fellow traveler in Pakistan, and very curious to hear your insights on these questions too, because I know you were having some of the same conversations. I think that really is the twin question right now facing Pakistan. So its policy towards Afghanistan proper, and then how it is struggling to manage some of the consequences that have emerged within Pakistan on the security front from the terrorist threats that it's facing, primarily from the TTP. So we'll start with the first piece of that on Afghanistan. It was really striking to reflect back on how public statements from Pakistani officials have shifted over the course of the last year, right? We had the, at least in Washington, infamous comments by Imran Khan that the Afghans had thrown off the shackles of slavery when the Taliban took control of Kabul. And fast forward to today, and I really found a Pakistan that was struggling to figure out how to calibrate its policy towards Afghanistan. There is a sense of I think frustration. I heard repeatedly of unrealistic expectations that had not been met in terms of how Taliban policy had impacted Pakistan. In my view, it was rather predictable that when the Taliban took power, they would not be fully in line with Pakistan's desires. We'd actually seen this back in the 1990s over the Duran Line issue, for example. And again, that has come up, though we've gotten the sense that both sides are trying to minimize those disputes to an extent. On the question of recognition, just to start there, I was curious what I would hear on the recognition question from Pakistan. They're seen as being closely linked to the Taliban, have had those relationships for over 20 years. And back this time last year, I think I would have anticipated more movement towards recognition from the region. But one of the interesting factors that really came out, echoing what Barney was noting, is that Pakistan is not in a position to want to go first on recognition. It is invested in this regional process. I think having gotten its hands burned from the experience in the 1990s, when it was the first and one of only 3 countries who recognized the Taliban regime, there is a sense of wanting to stick to this regional consensus, calling for an inclusive government, highlighting the issues of girls' education. So a lot of the same talking points, quite frankly, that we hear out of others in the international community, including here in Washington. Of course, the definition of the details and all of that is always in doubt, but there doesn't seem to be any pressure within Pakistan right now to push for recognition. I think where the question is, though, is what levers Pakistan itself and the broader international community have to try to shape incentives for the Taliban to influence their behavior. And you go back to your carrots and sticks. And I heard frustration from many in Pakistan on, for example, continued US and UN sanctions, the travel ban, and their theory of how best to bring the Taliban to a space of more moderation over time is through engagement, that we're not going to get anywhere if it's not through engagement, working with them, kind of predicting that a gradual process will play out. Also heard quite a bit on what Barney was alluding to with the generational split within the Taliban. Pakistan seems more optimistic that kind of the younger generation that's coming up is going to be more willing to engage with the international community, has lived abroad, understands that things have changed since the last time that the Taliban was in power. So that was very much the pitch that I heard, particularly from folks based in the center in Islamabad, a sense of kind of frustration, but also pushing for continued engagement, that over time attitudes will soften. But really coming back to that frustration issue, the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, is at the center of the dispute between the two sides right now. It's similar to what Yun was mentioning on frustration with Uyghur militants and the Taliban's lack of assistance there in throwing them out of the country. Pakistan had similar concerns about the TTP. We have seen a pretty dramatic increase in TTP attacks within Pakistan proper, as well as widespread extortion across Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which is the province that borders Afghanistan in Pakistan's west, increasing incidents of kidnap for ransom as well. And so many of the same background tensions and security concerns that we saw most recently in, say, 2005, 6, 7, seem like they are again emerging with the TTP. And Pakistan is really struggling to figure out how to try to insulate itself and force the Taliban to crack down on the TTP, which it alleges is, enjoying safe haven on the other side of the border in Afghanistan. Similar to what Yun was mentioning in terms of just moving the group, heard multiple reports that the Taliban had indeed shifted some membership of the TTP away from the border in an attempt to, again, try to limit those cross-border movements. But that hasn't been as effective as many in Pakistan would have hoped. I think interestingly, in the folks that I was speaking with, heard a bit of a split of perspectives from those based in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province and those based in the center. There is a greater sense of concern among those in the Northwest about how the situation with the TTP has escalated. You might have seen the protest that we saw just a couple days back in Swat, for example, after an attack on a school van just over 10 years after a similar attack on Malala Yousafzai, actually. And so that brought back some memories. Turning more to the Pakistan angle of this and how it's playing locally, I think when I was asking people how this felt in comparison to the last time that the TTP threat was really ascendant, one change that came out was that level of local opposition, a sense that people have lived through the TTP's influence previously, and that there will be pushback this time. And that's, I think, why we're seeing some of these protests in Swat, also reports of similar protests across the merged areas as well, in former Fatah, in the tribal areas, with both the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement as well as political parties getting into the mix and people coming out. So with that, I think the last thing I'll point to, and there's much to unpack here, is what Pakistan's strategy is going forward, right? So we've seen negotiations that the Afghan Taliban has facilitated with the TTP. Those have been kind of on again, off again, and really seem to have stalled after a so-called ceasefire was reached over the summer, but without a great deal to show for it. Attacks are continuing, and many people that I spoke with were frustrated by this approach of negotiations, which seems to overlook the opposition of local communities and the experience of having negotiated with the TTP previously, and the group will use those moments to consolidate its gains, and finds itself ascendant right now, right? They were closely linked with the Afghan Taliban, feel like they have taken this victory against the US and are looking to bring a similar approach into parts of Pakistan's border region. And so there's a sense that time is not right to sit down at the table, and that Pakistan actually looks weak in doing so. That was something that I heard repeatedly. But asked what the alternative was, there's not a whole lot of there, aside from kind of a continued policy of intelligence-based operations, trying to go after them at a tactical level. But especially in conversations that I had with people who were from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in the border region, a real sense that things are not trending in a positive direction, and that there's not a solid plan in place to try to address that. I think I'll leave it there, but lots more to unpack. Thanks.
Elizabeth, thank you. We're starting to see some questions coming in, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that you can put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom call, and so please keep those coming, and we'll get to those in a minute. But I did just want to do a quick follow-up with each of you. Barney, I know you had a comment that you wanted to make regarding some of what Elizabeth was just talking about. In addition to that, I was just hoping you could explain to us a little bit better why the regional players do actually seem to be united on this issue of inclusivity in Afghan politics. You mentioned that, but I think it'd be useful to understand better why. Why is that something that unifies them? And then I'll come to you with a question after that.
Okay, well, the point I wanted to make about Pakistan and terrorism is that Pakistan is the only neighbor of Afghanistan that is currently suffering from active cross-border terrorism coming from Afghanistan. As China is concerned about the prospect of it, but there haven't been any incidents. And in fact, the Uyghur question is very much more an internal Chinese question rather than a cross-border one. But of course, the distinction between cross-border and internal is almost non-existent in the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So it turns out that, right now, there are terrorists coming across into Pakistan from Afghanistan. Pakistan is firing into civilian areas of Afghanistan, causing civilian casualties. The Afghans are firing back, and the Indians are opening an office in Kabul. So you have to ask, what was all that about? Because basically the Taliban, our relationship with Pakistan is conforming very much to the relationship of other governments in Pakistan. The geography may be more powerful than ideology. As far as, what was your second question?
The issue of inclusivity. Why that's something that's actually a unifying issue for regional players?
Well, of course, it's a unifying issue because it has not been defined, in part. That is, no one really knows what it means. But what they all say, and they do say this in unison, is that the past 45 years have shown that any attempt to rule Afghanistan by a single small group will fail. It will generate opposition and create instability. And when I say instability, I don't mean abstract instability. It means it will create opportunities, in particular for the Islamic State, which is what they are all concerned about. That is, if ethnic conflict within the Taliban or between the Taliban and various communities starts weakening the state's hold on the security institutions and so on, then the major beneficiary of it is likely to be the Islamic State and not any of the Afghan political entities. And I think that is the overriding concern that those countries have.
So much more pragmatic than principled.
But I should just say that Zamir Kabulov, the special representative of President Putin for Afghanistan, who's quite influential on these matters, said that he's trying to bring together Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China to convince the Taliban to agree to an inclusive government. And their agreement to that is a condition for his reconvening the Moscow format process, which is the peace process that he has been working on since 2016.
Fascinating. Yun, I wanted to bring it back to you because the points that you made about sort of this disparity between what you might have expected to see from China or what China was saying about a year ago about the robust presence that it might have in Afghanistan, or at least some Chinese were saying this, including in the pages of the New York Times. And what you're actually seeing is so striking. And maybe in part from your travels, but also from your depth of understanding of Chinese decision-making and processes. Can you explain a little bit more? I understand they're frustrated with the Taliban and the intransigence of the Taliban on the Uyghur issue, but is there more at work here? Is this a kind of a reflection of a broader Chinese risk aversion, or is something about to change? Maybe this is a timeline. Maybe we'll see more activity coming up, or something else.
Thank you, Dan. That is a great question, and I've been thinking about this question of what is the cluster of factors that contributes to the Chinese reluctance to go into Afghanistan economically. There are indeed at least 4 factors. The first one is that I do think that the Taliban will have to meet certain criteria for China to engage. Remember that currently the two countries do not have a diplomatic relations per se. So I think the Chinese will have to see Taliban taking certain moves on the issue of the Uyghur militants residing in Afghanistan before they can even talk about, or they're willing to talk about, economic investment. There is a strong aversion toward risks because the Taliban regime is still relatively new, and whether the country will be stable is a big unknown. And based on what we have seen, not necessarily, and that prospect is at the best uncertain. So to go into another country with significant security risks on the ground, and remember all the security attacks, the terrorist attacks the Chinese have endured in neighboring Pakistan, it raises a question as for if China does go into Afghanistan now, is it going to generate more local resentment against Chinese businessmen, against Chinese investment? So this is extremely unclear for the Chinese just yet. So there's a matter of political conditionality. There's a concern about security risks. There's also concern about reputational damage. That with currently, for example, the Taliban, the Chinese have also called for inclusivity. And they have also called for Taliban to be more tolerant about issues such as girls' education in the country. Because if China chooses to work with Taliban under the current circumstance, China almost certainly will be finger pointed as the outlier or as the black sheep that chooses to work with a draconian government in Kabul. And that is a reputational damage the Chinese are not willing to carry. And last but not least, there's a question about the sanctions and how that will affect the Chinese companies or Chinese individuals that choose to work with the Taliban regime. It has been a very real factor in the Chinese consideration. So I remember vividly the New York Times article that was published by a Chinese interlocutor. I think it was more of a posturing to show what China could do in Afghanistan in light of the American withdrawal. So that is probably the bigger factor that contributed to that article instead of the real prospect of China going into Afghanistan. I think China will go, but just not now.
That's great. Thank you for a more detailed view there. Look, Elizabeth, I wanted to come back to you. There's actually a question from the audience. And again, you can submit questions through the Q&A function. But there's one that's I think right up your alley. It's regarding the United States and Pakistan and the TTP. So it says, although yesterday's release of the US's national security strategy had no mention of dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan, how is the US approaching the role of Pakistan in Afghanistan on counterterrorism? How does the TTP threat stemming from Afghanistan factor into US policy? So I'm sure sort of the straight up global CT questions were at least a part of your conversation. So I wanted to throw this one to you first.
Yeah, it's a great and timely question. I think, part of actually why we were both in Pakistan was reflecting on the 75th anniversary of bilateral ties between the two sides and doing some thinking about what the future of US-Pakistan relations look like going forward. Most of those conversations that I heard were more on the side of non-traditional security issues, things like health, education, climate, trying to shift the dial in how we think about each other as partners out of the security domain. And yet simultaneously, you have these countervailing pressures of terrorist threats emanating from Afghanistan, the TTP proper, that are pulling the relationship back to focus areas over the past 20 years. I think from the US standpoint, stability in the region is always going to be a priority, not least given Pakistan's influence and concerns about stability, though I want to be clear that, we're not back to where we were in, say, 2009, 2010. Things are very much not to that level yet. But the factor that's changed, right, is the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. And so much of the CT conversation that was happening over the last couple of decades was tied up in our presence in Afghanistan and wanting to bring stability, fight the Taliban at the time, that things have changed there. And so looking at the CT picture in Pakistan now, we see these same challenges with the TTP emerging. I think there's a greater sense of this is an issue that Pakistan is going to need to take on. And Pakistan itself has been trying to push the Taliban on this. And I had a couple of moments on the trip when I was hearing, as I mentioned, this frustration from colleagues in Pakistan over challenges trying to get the Taliban to do more to take action against the TTP. And there is a strange deja vu there because for so long, that was the frustration that US officials would express in trying to get Pakistan to do more to push the Taliban to not do X, Y, and Z. And so you find yourself in a situation where, I think there are limited overlapping interests in the CT space. Nobody wants to see groups like the TTP, ISK, which I haven't mentioned, but is also a factor in Pakistan as well, linked to its presence in Afghanistan. Nobody wants to see them gaining ground and threatening regional stability. But the other piece of this too is referencing the NSS. It was striking how much of the conversation has shifted here in Washington to great power competition, to what's playing out in Ukraine, to the rivalry with China. And there are just a whole lot of other pieces on that chessboard right now, such that the Afghanistan CT conversation is a smaller part, to my read, of the overall security picture for the US. So there's bandwidth challenges. And I think the partnership that Pakistan grew accustomed to while the US was on the ground in Afghanistan, working hand in glove on these issues, has changed as those global realities have changed. And so it's really an open question how both sides are going to find ways to cooperate in the limited space. By the same token, though, Pakistan is a partner that has access in Afghanistan, that has useful intelligence on what's happening on the ground. And so, I think there are pieces of that relationship can be useful for both sides. But it's likely to look quite different than it did, back when the US had 100,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I would echo that in terms of my own conversations. I was surprised, I would say, by the persistent Pakistani effort to shift to kind of turn the page or to shift the conversation away from some of these straight up security issues, but also struck by some of the narrowness of the cooperation on CT that the United States and Pakistan have right now. If anything, I would have thought that would be the firmest foundation on addressing specific threats going forward. But even there, I think there's a lot of frustration. Barney, I wanted to come back to you. There's a question here on Iran, and I know that's been an area of your interest over many years now. So the question is, what is Iran's role and approach to Afghanistan right now? Is it an improvised balancing act? Is it favoring one side in line with its Shia leadership role?
Well, first, bear in mind that we've just had a change of leadership in Iran and a change of the personnel dealing with Afghanistan, so that the special representative for Iran of Afghanistan now is a former Quds commander, Kazemi Qomi, who in his public statements has taken, I won't just say a hard line, that's kind of general, but a line that is focused on the United States. Okay, Iran's policy toward Afghanistan has not always been focused on the United States. In fact, in 2001, the then reformist government of President Khatami decided that Sunni extremists or terrorists were a greater threat to Iran and Afghanistan than the United States. And so it helped the United States get rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I think 20 years later, the current regime in Iran thinks that was a bad bet. And that they are, even though they still have their differences with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, nonetheless, they think that the larger threat to them became the U.S. presence on their borders. One of them, even Ali Akbar Velayati, the former foreign minister who now is advising the supreme leader, said that Afghanistan is now a member of the Axis of Resistance, which is the group of Iran-aligned anti-American movements and states in the Middle East. The Taliban, however, have not agreed that they are members of the Axis of Resistance. In fact, the Taliban, I think that one of Iran's main concerns about the Taliban is that the Taliban are actually extremely eager to improve their relations with the United States. In fact, they're much more interested in improving their relations with the United States than they are in improving them with China, Russia, or anyone else. That is their main priority. Now, Iran has expressed concern. When I say Iran here, I mean Mr. Kazemi Qomi has expressed concern about the massacres of the Shia that are taking place in Afghanistan. But so far, they have not reacted, let's say, practically in the same way that they did in Iraq when Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and then its successor, the Islamic State, were massacring Shia there. They have not. I haven't seen any evidence that they have started supporting militias or interfered in any way. Now, if this goes on, I think we will probably see that. But I think they are very concerned about spreading a war with the Islamic State onto their eastern border. So at the moment, they are simply, and they are coordinating their foreign policy with Russia, China, and Pakistan, so as not to get into the kind of damaging competition with Pakistan in particular that they did in the 1990s. Now, there are all kinds of strains on all of these things that could lead back in a different direction, but so far they haven't become evident.
That's great. What a strange set of expectations, say, that Iran has of the Taliban as compared to what the Taliban have for Iran and the United States. But it's just fascinating. Yun, I wanted to come back to you. There's a question here on UN Security Council sanctions with a China angle to it. So the question is, what are the prospects for the upcoming renewal of the UN Security Council sanctions regime? Would China support continuing the current sanctions, or would it seek to weaken them, including on travel bans?
Well, that is a good question. And my true answer is I don't know. But if we look at the past record of what the Chinese have been saying about UN sanction resolution against Afghanistan, the Chinese seems to stick to one issue, which is humanitarian assistance cannot be affected by political conditions. And there was quite a debate, for example, in December last year, as for whether the waiver that the UN Security Council resolution provided should be reviewed every 6 months or every 12 months. And my understanding from that debate is that the Chinese were advocating for a position for this waiver to be provided in a much longer duration. So I think based on that position, the Chinese seems to be firmly advocating for the continued humanitarian assistance without much of a conditionality to Afghanistan. But then, of course, the question is, does Taliban benefit from it, or what are the operational details of that operation? So I think that's basically what the Chinese will base their position on in the upcoming discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. Elizabeth, if I could come back to you, I mean, there's always been this question of Pakistan's will to deal with certain challenges in Afghanistan, but simultaneously, there's been a deep question about capacity. And Pakistan obviously facing a lot of different challenges right now. So I wondered, particularly in terms of its dealings with Afghanistan and the TTP, how you consider this capacity issue, given, one couldn't help but be struck by the convergence of economic crises and the flood and so on. So if you can speak to that, I think that would be helpful.
I think it's helpful to zoom out. Whoops, are you able to hear? All right, I think I'm going to turn off my video. I think let's see.
Well, you're back now, so.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hopefully the audio will hold out here. So it's a great question and helpful to zoom. Pakistan overall has been like the context in which this is all happening, right? So we have an ongoing political crisis in Pakistan with a great deal of uncertainty. We have flooding. A third of the country was underwater when we visited. There are significant economic challenges with Pakistan having to go back to the IMF and running a pretty alarming or running into issues with its foreign exchange reserves. So there is a broader bandwidth challenge in terms of overall capacity. And you add to that the security challenges that it faces. And so I think it is a situation where there is a lot going on. There could not be, in many ways, a worse time for this to be happening. We're also heading into the November expected changing the guard with the naming of a new chief of army staff. So I think looking forward, one thing to see is whether under the leadership of what's expected at least to be a new chief of army staff, will the negotiations policy continue? It is a relative low lift in terms of what it takes bandwidth-wise to kick the can down the road in some ways through these negotiations. But you think about what some of the alternatives are, and there's not a whole lot of good options, right? So keeping up these low-level kind of intelligence-based operations. There have been, as was mentioned earlier, cross-border airstrikes into Afghanistan. If things really escalate and get bad, I think we could see more of that cross-border operations, putting pressure on the Taliban. But the high-end option is something like we saw in 2014, 2015, with another Operation Zarbiya Zub, where the entire area is cleared out in hopes of tackling the militants. That only worked for a few years. It was hugely expensive. Millions of people were displaced. And I think that's just something that Pakistan doesn't have the capacity to do right now, even if it wanted to. We're not there yet. But this is a really challenging time across the board in Pakistan. So important to bring that out. I appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah, I would say I picked up similar things, that the economic pressures and other pressures on the Pakistani state make any robust response to these challenges all that much more difficult. Barney, I know you wanted to get in on this or something related, but there are also some really important questions about the peace process and Taliban attitudes about the peace process. There's one, what is the Taliban in Doha's view of continuing the peace process? Another, after over a year of Taliban rule, where should the sanctions regime go? How would withdrawing sanctions be meaningful or harmful to promoting the peace process? So if in addition to whatever you were going to say on the Pakistan issue, you want to jump in on the peace process, that would be great.
Sure. No, I think that from the point of view of the Taliban, the peace process is over. And due to their victory, there's peace in Afghanistan. So they do very much refer to the Doha Agreement as they understand it, as a point of reference, but they don't think that there could be a political process in Afghanistan, but they do not conceive of it as a continuation of the peace process. Regarding sanctions, I think that we should break that down a bit. First of all, there are a lot of different sanctions. And when sanctions are imposed, they come with either a UN Security Council resolution or a statement from the U.S. Treasury Department or whatever, saying these sanctions are being imposed for a reason. I remember when, in fact, in 2010, when we first got a message from the Taliban about what they wanted out of negotiations with the United States, and they said they wanted the sanctions lifted. Richard Holbrooke's response, he was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the time, was, oh, they want the sanctions lifted. That means we have leverage. Now, that was the purpose of the sanctions, to get leverage. But you only get that leverage if you tell the other side clearly what they need to do to get the sanctions lifted. So talking generally about the sanctions as a whole, because we're against the Taliban or something, really does not use them as leverage. What we need to do is decide ourselves what do we want the Taliban to do to get rid of the counter-terrorism sanctions, the counter-narcotic sanctions, and have some kind of a roadmap. And then it shouldn't be all done at once. So we shouldn't remove the sanctions. The Chinese, for instance, are not asking for all the sanctions to be removed, but they oppose extending the sanctions on travel by leaders of the regime precisely because they think that engagement is the way to work out how it might be possible to remove the sanctions. So now I don't know what happened. There was a meeting in Doha just in the last week or so between a delegation led by the deputy director of the CIA from the U.S. side and the director of the Taliban intelligence agency on the other side, as well as the diplomats. I don't know what was discussed there. I'm sure the sanctions regime was discussed there, but thus far, at least publicly, I haven't seen the United States use the sanctions strategically as leverage in order to get the Taliban to do certain concrete things.
Great, good point. So sanctions, rather than just punitive, they ought to be useful for something. And we should be clear on our own side what that something really ought to be. We're coming up toward the end of this. There's a question, though, for Yun that I wanted to get in on the table about Chinese investment. The question is, how does China square away its statements on BRI and connecting Afghanistan to CPEC with its aversion, as you noted, to investing in Afghanistan now? Does it try to square all of these issues?
Well, the Chinese have been talking about including Afghanistan in BRI since as early as, I believe, 2015 on the bilateral level with the previous Afghan government. So this is not a new talk. And this idea of connecting Afghanistan, turning Afghanistan into another wing of CPEC has also been discussed for quite a while, and it did not really transpire under the previous Ghani government. And of course, the primary concern there was relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan at that time, and also the internal instability of the country at that time. So for now, I don't think the Chinese will even try to square away which seems to present inconsistency in their position. The Chinese would simply say the opportunity or the condition for investment in Afghanistan has not ripened. There's not the security or the stability that we desire to see, and the government is not yet recognized by the international community. So there are more hurdles for to be conquered or to be overcome before the Chinese investment will actually transpire. So I don't necessarily see that they see a need to even explain why things are not yet happening. Thank you.
Great, and we're just coming up toward the end of the hour, but I did want to turn back to Barney for one last point because I was struck from some of what I've read that you've written about a kind of a bleak tone in terms of regional and global leadership on these issues. So if you wanted to expand on your observations there, I think that would be an important contribution.
Thank you. Well, I think what you're referring to is the fact that in certain respects, the objective conditions look to be unusually positive for the stabilization of Afghanistan. In the sense that there's a government, however repressive and so on, that controls the territory and population, and there's a kind of consensus among all the regional powers not to destabilize it, and on certain principles that they want that government to observe. In addition, that regional consensus is not really that different from what the American position is. However, the relations between the United States, on the one hand, and all the neighbors of Afghanistan are, of course, much worse than they have been in quite a long time. You know, probably the country with the most well worked out ideas for how to stabilize Afghanistan, I would say, is Russia. And obviously, there's no question of our collaborating with Russia. We could still possibly have a conversation with China, but as China is now the main threat identified by the new national security strategy, that will become increasingly difficult. Pakistan really doesn't, unfortunately, have that much to contribute at this point. And obviously, Iran, we have the same kind of relationship that we do with Russia. So at the moment, there doesn't seem any way, and the United Nations is of course, weakened by all of this. So there doesn't seem to be any way to take advantage of this, of what would otherwise be a kind of positive opportunity. In particular, we can't take advantage of what would otherwise be an opportunity to speak to the Taliban with one voice as an international community. Because, and then I might add also internally, Russia is under incredible pressure. The United States internally is under very sharp pressure. And Pakistan is going through the usual combination of crises, economic, political, ecological, etc. So that, and we see that Russia and Saudi Arabia appear to be betting on a change of power in the United States to change America's policy more in their favor. So that there doesn't seem to be any way to take advantage of the positive elements that do nonetheless exist.
Thank you for that great framing. Despite the framing that seems to be going on in your apartment building, that's great intellectual framing. Thanks to all of you for incredible insights from the region. I think very useful and level setting here over a year out from the U.S. departure from Afghanistan. It's important to take stock, and it's important to get out to the region to hear what folks there are saying. So I'm going to toss it back to Yun if you want to close out the meeting, and thanks for the opportunity to moderate.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your terrific moderating of the session. I think we covered a lot of ground, and thanks to Barney and to Elizabeth for sharing your wisdom and your findings from the research trip. And with that, I think we can close the session. Look forward to future dialogues and future engagement on this issue with all of you. Thank you. Have a good day.